It's the 27th of October, 2015, and this is episode 259. This show is intended for informational and educational purposes only. Cryptocurrency is new, exciting, and empowering, but we're not experts, just obsessed companions walking the road towards a more peer-to-peer future. Hi, and welcome to Let's Talk Bitcoin, a twice-weekly show exploring the ideas, people, and projects building the new digital economy and the future of money. My name is Adam B. Levine, and today we're talking about the realities of Bitcoin. Josh Cincinnati of BlockCypher recently spoke at the SF Bitcoin Developers Meetup about the attack on the Bitcoin network that took place over the July 4th weekend, what happened, and what it means. But first, let's talk about the Blockchain Alliance. First, we hear from Bruce Fenton about his concerns with the nascent organization, followed by an introduction and explanation from Jason Weinstein, who's leading the effort. Enjoy the show. On today's episode of Let's Talk Bitcoin, we're joined by Bruce Fenton, Executive Director of the Bitcoin Foundation.
Great to be back.
So we're talking about the Blockchain Alliance, which was recently announced and which basically is intending to be kind of like a collaboration forum between law enforcement and members of the Bitcoin or cryptocurrency community to, quote, catch the bad guys. So what's wrong with this?
That's exactly it, the stated mission. Some people have said the goal is kind of to encourage better regulations. And I think if that's the goal, then it's not the best way to do so, because these aren't regulators and they don't really have much more say about regulation than a lot of other groups. But that's not the stated goal. The stated goal is, just like you said, it's to catch the bad guys, which I just don't think. First of all, I respect all of these people quite a bit. They're really great people that are part of this alliance. I'm really good friends with a lot of them, and they're great professionals. But I just don't think catching the so-called bad guys is the best use of our time. I think it has a lot of downside and not that much upside.
So when you say our time, what exactly do you mean? Whose time is it that is going to take that would be used for other more valuable things, or why isn't this worth the time?
I don't know how much time they're spending on it, so it's hard to judge. But just by putting the industry names out there and by having such high-profile people and companies involved in it, I should say focus may be better than time, because it's something that I just don't think is the best focus. Because a lot of these organizations that are part of this alliance on the law enforcement side, Department of Homeland Security, Immigration Service, these kind of groups, they don't necessarily have a great alignment with not only our community, but really America in some ways about who bad guys are. You know, they have pretty bad track records with chasing down people that a lot of Americans really don't think should be chased down. And so I think that if there's efforts being done to help these law enforcement agencies, whether it's, catching illegal immigrants who are trying to earn a living by working in restaurants, or legal medical marijuana users in states like Colorado, where the voters have already voted that this is something they want. Those kind of things have a lot of downside if we're going to help law enforcement catch those people, and not a lot of upside, because I think it's a pretty overly optimistic stretch to think that the Department of Homeland Security or some of these agencies are going to be so enamored by us and so thrilled by the help that our industry provides in catching who they believe are bad guys, that they then go kind of outside their box of enforcement and try and influence policy and work with actual regulators or legislators.
What ways could industry participants, as they've been described, actually help law enforcement? Is this like they would disclose all of their records, or do you not know? You also might not know the answer to this.
The proceedings have not been public. They, I believe, announced that they're not going to allow the public or members of the media to attend their meetings, which, by the way, in and of itself, we have a lot of drives for transparency in our industry, but in and of itself, I don't necessarily have a problem with that. There are sometimes very good and valid reasons for people to have privacy in meetings, but the fact is we just don't really know what this cooperation entails.
Bruce, do you have any information that isn't public at this point, or is this just you're speaking out because you have concerns that this is going to wind up being something that is very bad when all the details do come out?
I know a lot of people in the industry and talk to a lot of people, and it's kind of a continual rumor mill, but I don't think I have any super huge insight other than what has been publicly announced, which is a decent amount. We know which organizations are involved, we know who's running it, we know which groups in law enforcement are involved, and I think that I don't really see a way that, unless there's something I'm really missing, and I hope there is. I hope I'm wrong. I hope that I've reached out to Jerry and others, haven't really heard back much. I hope that there's something I'm missing, and they come back and say, "Hey, here's why you're misunderstanding it." But from what I've seen, I just don't think that that's possible. I don't see anything positive that comes out of this, and I don't really see the benefit of working with these particular organizations. I think that we'd be a lot better off if we focused on regulators, or especially elected officials. They're the ones with the most accountability. I don't see it as our industry role to help law enforcement catch bad guys. I think that the best case would be that the industry group exists to simply comply with law enforcement requests, in which case, why would it need to exist at all? Of course, we should always comply with law enforcement requests when, I shouldn't say we should always, I mean, it depends on the country you are in, and it depends on whether those requests are moral. I mean, there's certainly members of the Bitcoin Foundation in other countries that are, at least in my opinion, do some really horrible things. In some countries, it's illegal to be gay, for example. So it doesn't always make sense to just blindly follow all laws in all places. Now, fortunately, in our country, we don't have those problems, but we do have cases where there are some pretty questionable acts by some of these agencies. And even if you don't think that they're questionable acts, or you agree with 100% of what the agencies do, I think that it's not really our role or our place as an industry to help law enforcement. And that's probably why you see so few of these particular types of alliances with other tech groups and advocacy groups. One just final thing I would say is that I know a lot of these people really well, and I like them. And I whether I have concerns about this or we end up disagreeing on the exact process, I really believe that these are good people and good companies who want the best for Bitcoin. And whatever way this goes, I look forward to working with all of them to help this industry as much as possible.
I'm Jason Weinstein, a partner at Steptoe & Johnson and the director of the newly formed Blockchain Alliance. I wanted to give you all a brief overview of the Alliance, both what it's intended to be and why it's so important for the growth of Bitcoin and other applications for the blockchain. And although the reaction to the announcement of the Alliance last week has been overwhelmingly positive, I also wanted to take a few moments to address the criticism of the Alliance voiced principally by Bruce Fenton of the Bitcoin Foundation. But first, what is the Blockchain Alliance? Why was this whole thing created? Well, the idea for the Alliance grew out of discussions I had with a wide array of Bitcoin and blockchain companies, as well as with the Chamber of Digital Commerce and Coin Center, about potential obstacles that could prevent digital currencies in the blockchain from reaching their potential. One issue that kept coming up in those discussions was the misperception of Bitcoin as the so-called currency of criminals. Now, that's a perception problem, to be clear, but it's one that could have very real consequences. It could impact adoption and investment and the way that lawmakers and regulators and enforcement agencies approach this technology. So we work with the companies and organizations to try to find a way to deal with that perception problem in a proactive way. And as a model, we went back 20 years to the earliest days of commercial applications for the internet. You see, about 20 years ago, law enforcement agencies turned to internet companies to help teach them how the technology worked, so they can improve their capacity to go after criminals who misuse that technology to facilitate crimes. And that effort between the public and private sector went a long way toward dialing down concerns about the internet. Now, it's ironic, to say the least, that even though criminal use of the internet is rampant and was from the very beginning, nobody today thinks of the internet as the network of criminals. Instead, we think of the internet as a place where we all work and shop and socialize and communicate and consume entertainment and learn. And that's as it should be. And through the Alliance, we're trying to do the very same thing for the blockchain. So what will the Blockchain Alliance do? Well, plain and simple, it's a resource. It's a resource for law enforcement and regulators where they can feel comfortable asking technical questions to some of the brightest minds in the Bitcoin and blockchain space. And at the same time, it's a resource for the blockchain community to better understand the interests and concerns of these government agencies regarding the technology and its applications. Now, to be clear, some of this is happening now on an ad hoc basis between individual agents and agencies and individual companies. What's different is that the Blockchain Alliance will provide the same function as a one-stop resource. So why is all of that good for Bitcoin and the blockchain? Well, whether you're a consumer or a company or an innovator or an investor or just someone who wants to see this technology thrive, it's in all of our interest to make sure that when law enforcement goes after money launderers and other criminals using a new technology like Bitcoin and the blockchain, they do so with a fuller understanding of how it works, so they don't paint with too broad a brush or attack with too broad a sword. The last thing any of us wants to see is law enforcement or regulators taking actions that negatively impact lawful activities of the many, when what they're really trying to get at is criminal activities by the few. That's why it is so important to educate law enforcement agencies and regulators about how this technology works, and to take the time to help them get comfortable with it, so they can do their jobs without stifling the innovation that is so central to the growth of Bitcoin and other applications for the blockchain. The reality is that by educating law enforcement agents and regulators directly about this technology, we will reduce their fear or anxiety about it, and will make them less likely to overreact to it. And that in turn will make it less likely that lawmakers will overreact as well. And will also be helpful for those of us on the industry side to hear about what law enforcement's worried about in terms of the misuse of the technology for illegal purposes. Now, as I said before, the reaction since we announced the alliance on October 22nd has been almost uniformly positive. We've been flooded with emails from other companies seeking to participate, and we're very gratified by the overall positive response. But not all of the response has been positive, as you'd expect in any venture like this. And for the most part, the criticism has come from Bruce. Now, some of it has been about the very idea of the alliance, and some of it has been directed at me personally. Now, the stuff about me is far less important, so let me just deal with that quickly, and then I'll turn to the concerns about the alliance itself. Bruce has made some assertions about my having gotten caught up in the Fast and Furious episode while I was at the Justice Department, and he suggested that this somehow reflects poorly on me as a leader of the alliance. But he is wrong both on the facts and in his conclusions from those facts. It is widely understood among people who actually know the facts that the DOJ IG report on Fast and Furious got it wrong, that not only was I not involved in the Fast and Furious investigation, but I was actually the person within the administration who first raised the alarm about ATF gunwalking. Now, I resigned from DOJ in the fall of 2012 after a long career there, both to be able to fight back against the inaccuracies in that report and to avoid becoming a further distraction from the department's work. And I did so with very strong support from the federal law enforcement community. And that is all well documented in numerous news stories from that period of time, including, for example, a Washington Post story that came out in January 2013 that is perhaps the fullest treatment of that whole episode. But I would suggest to you that what's much more important than why I left DOJ is what I do for a living now. Because I'm a defense lawyer. I spend my time defending and protecting companies and individuals when law enforcement agencies and regulators come after them. Now, Bruce may not like the idea of the alliance, and we'll talk about that in a second. But given what his concerns are about it, I would suggest that a person who has enormous credibility with law enforcement, but whose job is actually to protect companies and individuals from law enforcement, and on top of that, a person who has actually personally experienced what it's like when a government agency makes false accusations about him, is actually the perfect person to lead an organization like the Alliance. Now to Bruce's concerns about the Alliance itself. Bruce clearly has strong views about the priorities and tactics of law enforcement and what he perceives to be government overreaching. We don't need to debate the merits of that, because the bottom line is that engagement with law enforcement agencies and regulators is precisely the best way to prevent the very overreaching that Bruce is concerned about. Now, as I said before, reducing law enforcement's fear and anxiety about any new technology by improving their understanding of it is the best way to prevent the kind of aggressive response that sweeps too broadly and that stifles innovation and legitimate commerce. The fact is that education and proactive engagement are critical. The alternative, putting our heads in the sands and refusing to engage, is a recipe for disaster. It's a recipe for bad laws and bad regs and an overly broad government response. Now, I wish that Bruce had raised these concerns with me directly. I would have been happy to correct his misimpressions about me and to discuss his broader concerns about the Alliance. And I'm, of course, still happy to do that now with Bruce or anyone else who shares his concerns. The bottom line is this industry needs all hands on deck. We need all hands on deck if this industry is going to thrive, and we need all the help we can get from people like Bruce who are passionate about its future. Now, that doesn't mean we're always going to agree about how to achieve our goals, but we should remember throughout that we're all acting in good faith based on what we believe is the best way to ensure the brightest possible future for this transformative technology. Now, there will always be people seeking to use technology to commit crimes. That has been true for every technological advance since the telephone. And it's also true that criminals are always the earliest adopters of any new technology, and law enforcement is always trying to catch up. Bitcoin and the blockchain are no different. Law enforcement will never drive criminals entirely off the blockchain, just like they will never eliminate crime on the internet. But for the blockchain to thrive as the internet has, all of us who are passionate about this industry need to work together to change perceptions about it. And by using the Blockchain Alliance as a resource for law enforcement, we can help law enforcement protect public safety, while at the same time combating misperceptions about Bitcoin and demonstrating that the companies in this space are not only good companies, they're good corporate citizens. If we help law enforcement learn more about this technology, they will get better at going after the criminals who misuse it, in a way that does not inhibit the ability of the rest of us to use it and to develop new and exciting applications for it. And that will be a huge step toward creating an environment where the full potential of Bitcoin and the blockchain can be realized. I want to congratulate the Digital Chamber and Coin Center and the nearly 20 other organizations and companies who are participating in the Alliance for their vision in recognizing why this is so important for the ecosystem and for having the determination to make it a reality. I also want to say thanks to Let's Talk Bitcoin and to Adam for inviting me to do this, and thanks to all of you for taking the time to listen to it. Thank you.
Today's episode of Let's Talk Bitcoin is brought to you commercial-free by Tokenly.com. This song is called C for Four Hands by Daniel Kolsch, and it's originally written by Niles Fromm. Thanks for listening. The magic word for today's episode is right. That's R-I-G-H-T. Right. You've got until the 3rd of November to visit letstalkbitcoin.com or the Let's Talk Bitcoin iOS app to enter it for your share of the listener rewards.
Thank you. I'm going to talk a little bit about what happened in early July in the Bitcoin network, how the network sort of adapted, how participants in the network adapted, and in particular, how BlockCypher adapted as an infrastructure company based off of the attack that happened in July. So to start, I won't go over much of the intros again, but as Michael mentioned, I'm the developer advocate for BlockCypher. I love helping developers build awesome stuff on Bitcoin and various other cryptocurrencies, and this is the only part of the presentation where I'm just going to be a shameless promoter for BlockCypher. I swear. BlockCypher is a way to make development a lot easier for folks that are interested in building on blockchains. So we're basically like an Amazon Web Services for blockchains. So if you, instead of running your own Bitcoin Core daemon, you can just hit a JSON API. It's mostly RESTful, super robust, best SLA in the business. You get to focus on your idea, and we focus on the infrastructure. So that's it. We'll save the shilling for later. And instead, let's just go ahead and dive into what happened in early July. So I don't know how many of you guys were like celebrating Independence Day. It was a fun holiday. Most people do celebrate Independence Day. Unfortunately, for people in the Bitcoin world, they had a different kind of independence, the independence of a soft fork. So this graph behind me is basically showing the average number of blocks that have, of the last 1,000 blocks, the number of them that have gotten to version 3, which was part of BIP 66. So you'll notice that in this date around here, July 4th is when basically BIP 66 went from activation to enforcement. And the reason that ended up being such a big issue, here's sort of a brief explainer on what BIP 66 actually does. So BIP 66 is effectively a reduction of the kinds of signatures that are allowed in Bitcoin transactions. So it enforces what are called strict DER signatures in the code. And previously, Bitcoin had been relying on OpenSSL to provide those signatures. As we all know from, if anyone recognizes that icon, reliance on OpenSSL is not exactly the best idea ever. And so this Bitcoin improvement proposal was basically created to reduce that reliance and to reduce also the number of possible outcomes for signatures in Bitcoin. And it followed sort of a similar path to BIP 34, which is to say, once 750 out of the last 1,000 blocks had version 3 blocks, which denoted satisfying BIP 66, then the rules would be activated for all blocks that had V3 as their version number. It then made V2 blocks invalid after you reached 950 blocks out of the last 1,000. What was sort of supposed to happen was something like this. Where there was always a chance, even after BIP 66 was activated, that there would be an invalid block mined by 5% of the hashing power. And that chain could have been longer, but the probability of that chain becoming longer gets vanishingly small so long as the vast majority of hashing power was, mining valid blocks. And so effectively what we all expected to happen is that when miners were saying that they enforced V3 blocks, we thought that they were telling the truth and they were actually validating those blocks themselves. But it didn't end up happening that way. Instead, as it turned out, miners were signaling that they were enforcing those blocks, aka they were putting V3 into the blocks that they were mining, but in reality, many of them, roughly 50%, it seems, were not actually checking to see if they were conforming to those BIP 66 rules. And what ended up happening is that we had a 6-block soft fork on July 4th and then another 3-block soft fork on July 5th. Now, the main reason this is a big problem is that the miners were signaling that they were in fact conforming to these rules, but in reality they were acting quite differently. The reason that they were acting differently is that they were basically trying to gain a certain amount of speed advantage in the network. So most of these miners were weren't validating any transactions in the block. They were doing what's called SPV mining, but a better term for that would have been basically like just looking at the headers and mining off of those block headers instead of actually mining off of the full block and validating all those transactions. If they'd been doing that full validation, then this fork wouldn't have happened. So what does this all mean for the end user at this point? Basically, everyone in Bitcoin was told, just wait for this to blow over. There was, I believe, if any of you went to the bitcoin.org page, there's a big do not transact unless you've got 30 confirmations. There's all of this, basically a lot of confusion about whether people were on the right fork or not. And a lot of credit, I think, goes to the Bitcoin core developers who were actively engaged in conversations with some of these miners to get them to actually get back on the right fork, so to speak. But ultimately, this wasn't really, it was a pretty big deal temporarily. but it wasn't as big of a deal as sort of what happened next, I think, fundamentally to the rest of the network. So in July 6th, not a day later after having just dealt with that fork, we suffered a massive attack, and unfortunately not famed trip-hop British sensation massive attack, although it definitely caused some teardrops to those of you who know their discography. How many people actually heard about the spam attack on July 6th? Was there? Okay, awesome, great. I'm glad that you all said that, because there did seem to be a fair amount of confusion about it, at least on a lot of online communities. A lot of people thought it was a continuation of a stress test, but in reality it was sort of a sophisticated, well-funded denial of service attack on the Bitcoin network. And I'll sort of explain that in a minute. But in early June, CoinWallet.eu announced that they were going to engage in a stress test on the Bitcoin network. And they did so on June 22nd, and they announced on June 28th, but it didn't really end up hitting until June 30th or so. Many people confuse that stress test for the actual spam attack that occurred right after the BIP66 fork. And you can tell the difference quite starkly just by looking at even just this one indicator. So this is TPS's transactions per second. You can see June 22nd doesn't even go above a line there. And then June 30th, you see a little bit of a bump in transactions per second. But the spam attack, which started on June 6th, is a completely different animal. Completely different. So you're talking about spiking up to 200 transactions per second. The transactions themselves, unlike the stress test in June, they were varied. They had various amounts of inputs and outputs. It was much more volatile, and people were just sort of unsure where it was coming from. No one was claiming responsibility. So it was a completely different animal compared to those stress tests. As a quick refresher, why does it matter if TPS is above a certain amount? There is inherently a TPS limit in Bitcoin. I'm sure many of you already know this math, so it might be repeating it a little bit, but just in case those in the audience don't know, roughly every 10 minutes a block is discovered in the Bitcoin network. That is just an average, and it varies quite wildly, as is the nature in the random process that is block discovery. Those blocks have a 1 megabyte limit. The minimum amount of size for each transaction is around 250 bytes. That's for one input and two outputs. If you just do the math, a million bytes divided by 250 is around 4,000 transactions per block. 4,000 transactions divided by 600 seconds, and you get 6.6 TPS. In the real world, it's actually a little bit lower because not every transaction is the minimum. In fact, in the middle of this attack, someone mined a 1 megabyte transaction, even though the is standard test only allows up to 100 kilobyte transactions, but they were a miner, and so they could do what they wanted there. But effectively, like, the real world TPS limit is actually quite a bit lower. And so what happens when the TPS limit goes above that block discovery limit? Normally, the mempool stays around 2,000 to 3,000 transactions, and they all get cleared away into the next block. That didn't happen in this spam attack. The mempool.
What was that number? I missed.
Like 2,000 to 3,000. Yeah, roughly. Although that's an average, and it sort of depends. But generally, that corresponds to the block being about half full. So most blocks are around, before the spam attack, were around 500 kilobytes or so. So when TPS goes beyond that, like that 5 mark, the mempool balloons. And the reason that's bad is because it causes huge strain on individual nodes, and ultimately it creates this sort of disparity on the amount of transactions that are actually securely embedded in the blockchain and transactions that are just sort of floating around in mempools. So effectively, my favorite euphemism is that the attacker decided to drop the kids off at the mempool, which, if you know the meaning of that idiom, it is literally like crapping up the mempool. And a lot of nodes broke under the pressure. So effectively, what happened is that the mempool itself just had all of these cars as transactions, and they're trying to be funneled into the limited sort of space that was available in those blocks, and it was kind of metaphorically similar to this. In essence, real estate in the blockchain became fundamentally precious, right? In most normal cases, the block is only half full before the spam attack. So you had around 500 kilobytes per block. And after this, you had, at one point, the mempool got up to 200,000 transactions. And of those 200,000 transactions, miners are only incentivized to find the top 4,000 in terms of fees and then sort of leave the rest off. And you can imagine there being like a huge backlog problem from additional transactions coming into the mempool in addition to those already there. So real estate became less like sort of nuclear test grounds in Nevada and more like San Francisco real estate. Fees went up about 25x on the minimum and around 3x for most average fees. It also created the appearance of double spends. So in reality, these double spends it was a mixture of a number of things. It wasn't just people attempting to malevolently double spend. Some degree of double spends were from people just trying to respend their Bitcoin that weren't being confirmed in a block. Another portion was people trying to malevolently double spend, take advantage of the sort of chaos of the spam transactions. And then a little bit was also the attacker trying to reduce the cost of the attack by respending their own transactions as well. That died down, and by July 18th, 19th, 20th, the mempool was back to normal size, and we continued on as a network, so that's great. But I think it'd be interesting, especially since y'all are Bitcoin developers, to go into how BlockCypher, how our infrastructure was tested, and how we responded. And to borrow, if anyone is a Go programmer, undoubtedly intimately familiar with that particular line, which is everywhere in Go code base, but to borrow a little bit from our code base to if error is not equal to nil is sort of human. And so we are, while we pride ourselves at being the most reliable, robust blockchain API in the business, we did have some shortcomings that we resolved as a result of the spam attack. So the first thing that happened is that these double spends ended up revealing slow code. In our implementation of a Bitcoin node, we were basically doing a double for loop to ascribe a certain double spend to an address. We were testing every single address, regardless of whether one of them was associated with a double spend. And that was a really easy fix, as it turns out. Because all you had to do was look at, the double spend, and it would show you addresses associated with that transaction. And we went from, that weird OIJ notation to just OI, basically. But the thing is, what's interesting is that we would have never known about this particular piece of code because we didn't really need to optimize before. There are only so many double spend attempts that were happening. It wasn't, bringing down a piece of our infrastructure, which it didn't bring down, I should say, but it did spike our CPU utilization up quite a bit. So once we realized that double spend graph was what was causing this was a super easy fix. It was like a 6-line piece of code. So the other thing that this sort of brought to our attention is that our webhooks infrastructure got tested a great deal. So one of the things, we have an events-based system where whenever something happens, we can send out notifications either through WebSockets or webhooks. And we kind of had a perfect storm of a variety of events that our customers subscribed to that resulted in massive, massive spikes. So in addition to that double spend graph, we have an unconfirmed transaction webhook event, and when you have 100, 200 TPS and many, many, many customers subscribe to that, you can see how that would potentially stress things. Additionally, there was a parallel attack happening on testnet 3. Our events architecture is extracted out from whichever blockchain that we're actually querying. So effectively, there was a perfect storm of all of this stuff happening, even worse on testnet in some cases during the spam attack. Luckily, this was actually also a relatively simple fix in that a lot of this infrastructure sort of scaled linearly. So ultimately, all we did is threw machine power at the problem, and it wasn't as big of a deal, and we kind of moved on. The last thing that was sort of a huge problem initially, and one that was a little bit more subtle, is what I was mentioning before about our mempool infrastructure, or about mempools in general. So the way that we had our unconfirmed transactions associated with addresses was basically like a giant map. So the key was the address, and the value was this sort of pseudo object that we call a transaction reference. And we were storing this for every single address regardless of whether anyone was querying that address against our system. So we were doing this again previously because the mempool was never much larger than 2,000 transactions. You bump that up by 100x, and you start to see the strain on infrastructure. So we streamlined it. Effectively, we generated this information on demand, and instead of having that full transaction reference object in memory, in active memory, all we have is the unconfirmed transaction hashes. And if we ever needed to actually build that response, we would just do it on demand, and we had a few layers of caching involved that keeps it relatively intelligent and still to the point where no one really noticed any degradation of service at all. That took a little bit longer to figure out and to adapt, but ultimately, it was a really, really great project for us because it streamlined our mempool implementation to the point that now we could hold 1 million addresses and, with 15 transactions each and only take 400 megabytes in active memory. So that was a really, really huge improvement. To sort of go back to what, the conclusions about this particular attack and what we've learned, I think, as a Bitcoin community. The silver lining is that Bitcoin was sort of robust. The network can handle 200 transactions per second quite well. Whether they get into a blockchain swiftly, it's the open question. But the network survived, and for the most part, most folks didn't really notice too much of a disruption of service, except for folks who, in the very beginning, sent out transactions. And for many people who were using wallets that didn't have any sort of adaptive fee structure, they were also left out in the dark a little bit, which was one of the problems, which I'll sort of get into now. So the first big problem that this attack showed is that it was way, way too cheap. Way too cheap. Ultimately, it's of a level where if someone just wants to spend, $5,000 going to Vegas or $5,000 disrupting a global payment network, they could choose to disrupt a global payment network. And I'd rather they go to Vegas, I'd rather they lose their money there. So the reason that where I come up with this $5,000, as I mentioned earlier, blocks before the spam attack were roughly 500 kilobytes or so. What the attacker had to do was fill up those blocks and then some, and at minimum, that meant filling up that extra 500 kilobytes with the minimum fee necessary. And if you sort of do the math again, it's around 16.2 Bitcoin per day, which winds up going to about $4,600 or $5,000. The next problem is that it created a new normal in higher fees. So yes, disruption in service for most Bitcoin users that had wallets that adapted to having estimated fees, it wasn't affected. But ultimately, they were being charged at a much higher rate than they were previously. The big problem there, so for many of you, you probably don't care if you're spending 5 cents or 15 cents to include a transaction in the blockchain. That doesn't make a material difference to anyone in the audience here. That makes a massive difference if you're trying to pitch Bitcoin as a solution to the unbanked, right? To folks that are in the third world trying to be a part of internet commerce. If all of a sudden their fee structure goes up to a point where it materially affects their ability to live, that's a huge problem. So in order for, I think that for most people, like, oh no, I have to pay another 10 cents, 15 cents or something. I don't really care about us. I care about the future use cases of Bitcoin and how big of a problem this could be later on. 80 bytes per op return, it's still like 300 bytes and then like 60,000 satoshis per kilobyte, right? So yeah, some of those data embedding, it used to be a lot cheaper to embed data in the blockchain, which does disrupt a complete other use case, not even related to sort of the unbanked, but just for people that are trying to do stuff like proof of existence or colored coins off of Bitcoin as well. Yeah. So I think that's a huge problem and something that should be addressed or thought about or resolved. The other big issue, which I sort of highlighted a bit on our own infrastructure and our own adaptation to it, is that large mempools relative to block size are really, really bad. And the truth is that the mempool is a misnomer. In reality, it's a number of mempools. Everyone has their own implementation. Everyone has their own hardware they're running these mempools off of. And ultimately, like in the middle of this attack, there were nodes coming on and offline as they crashed and wiping their mempools. Now, granted, most people ended up trying to rebroadcast, but that creates uncertainty, and that creates certainly for the end user who tries sending Bitcoin and expects a 10-minute confirmation and gets no feedback on that. That's really, really, really bad. And now there are potentially ways around this, but it's still, I think what we all have to keep in mind is that ultimately we don't want transactions in the mempool, we want them on the blockchain, right? And the larger the mempool is relative to block size, the harder it is to get those transactions into the blockchain. So the golden, and I adjusted this since my last presentation, /Bitcoin lining, if we're going to look at Bitcoin as the new gold, is that these issues are all solvable. What's already happened in Bitcoin Core 0.11 to, again, the Bitcoin Core developers credits, they are created options for nodes to limit free transactions and to up the minimum fee required for relays, which will maybe make it more expensive for these attacks if a lot of nodes voluntarily decide to get involved in that policy. I think the other, and this might be a hot button issue, and I apologize to bring it up, but the other key here, or one astute observation, is that larger block sizes would make a lot of these issues less problematic. So the attack itself, if you're talking about 20 megabyte block, the attack itself would be 19x more expensive. So it's still well within the reach of some angry state actors who want to torpedo Bitcoin, which is still a problem, right? But it's out of reach of someone who's having a bad day and doesn't want to go to Vegas. So I think that's pretty relevant. And the other relevant thing is that ultimately, like, more of these transactions would get out of the mempool and into a block more quickly. I ultimately think that there are other potential solutions here. And ultimately, I think the real golden lining here is that Bitcoin as a network survived and was proven to be quite robust. And so that's really ultimately the best news, is that everything still works, but we can make it work better.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Let's Talk Bitcoin. Content for today's show was provided by Josh, Jason, Bruce, and Adam. Music for today's show was provided by Jared Rubens and Daniel Kolsch. This episode was edited